Hello, my name is Mike Morris, co-director of Writing on the Wall, and welcome to WoWFEST Lockdown, our 20th anniversary festival and our first ever fully online festival. Tonight, we're here to celebrate Resist Stories of Uprising, the new collection by the ever-brilliant Comma Press, which follows on from Protest Stories of Resistance, released a couple of years ago. It mixes fiction with essays about protests within Britain from as far back as AD 60 or 61 of Boudicca, through to the well-known rebellions of Peterloo, the Tolpuddle Martyrs and Cable Street, and lesser-known protests too, including the Oxfordshire Rising of 1596, the Rebecca Riots of 1839, the murder of Blair Peach in 1979, and onwards to the contemporary events, movements and rebellions, including the work of the authors with me today, Lucas Stewart, Colleen Smith and Julia Bell, who've created short stories on the Notting Hill riots of 1958, the Grenfell Tower fire of 2017, and one that I had personal experience of being involved in, the Liverpool Dockers strike of 1995 to 98, out of which Writing on the Wall itself grew. There will be readings from each of the writers, and then there'll be plenty of time for question and answers. So if you've got any questions, anything you'd like to explore with the writers, find out about either their writing technique, how they came to write the stories, or about the events themselves, then you can put them in the comments box on Facebook, and they'll be fed through to us, and we'll pass them on to the writers as well. First up is Julia Bell. Julia is a writer and director of the Creative Writing MA at Birkbeck University of London. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in the White Review, Times Literary Supplement, the Paris Review and the BBC. She's published 3 novels. Her short story, Fear in Your Water, which is featured in this collection, explores the deep, ongoing injustice and the impact of mental health of the 2017 Grenfell Tower fire and its aftermath. So please, welcome to WoWFEST Lockdown, Julia Bell.
Hi, hello. This time I start my video instead of looking at an audience, which is kind of weird. So hello from my kitchen, and it's a real pleasure to be at the WoWFEST, even on lockdown. I think I came to one in the very early days, many years ago, and I had a really fantastic and inspiring time. I'm just going to read a short section, 2 very short sections from the story Fear in Your Water, which is about Grenfell. And I have to say, I felt very heavy responsibility writing about this issue, because I know how much it divided London and how much I think it felt very personal to a lot of us. I connected to several friends who live in West London who had the Kensington and Chelsea management organisation managing their building, and maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later. And it was quite clear for many years before this happened that there was something very, very dodgy going on with the Kensington and Chelsea tenant management organisation. And when it actually happened, it was a lot of people who lived in that neighbourhood who were my friends were really not surprised. Anyway, this is just a short extract. The narrator is living in the tower before the fire. I had a girlfriend once, and we lived in this flat together. She still checked in from time to time, but she was mostly gone with someone better and healthier. I just can't look after you, she said, crying. I didn't blame her really. Most of the time I could hardly get out of bed, but it did make me lonely to think of her, happy with her new partner. You can stay here until you sort yourself out, that's what she said. But I didn't want to move out. I was safe there. Next door were all right. Mrs. Obadike or her son sometimes brought her leftovers, and in return I would feed their cat. People looked out for each other, were generally kind, whatever they like to say in the papers about council estates being rough. Then my ex helped me take over the contract and set it up so the housing benefit paid the rent. But now there was something going on with that. Letters I didn't want to open, piling up by the door. I'd been meaning to take them over to Mrs. Obadike, but speaking to people was getting increasingly difficult. Whenever I tried, my mouth became dry and sticky and I trembled with nerves. Thinking about this made me sick. I needed to get out, get some fresh air. Although the weather was heavy and hot, there were storm clouds looming east. It was hard to separate them in the haze of the polluted sky. I took the stairs because only one lift was working and the hallway was full of builders. The tower had become like an island, marooned in a construction site, cut off from the world by a sea of scaffolding. Regeneration, what a bullshit word. They were just covering the building in some fancy tiles to make it look smarter for the people who had to look at them. Why should poor people live in a rich area? That's what they thought. But it wasn't always this way. This area wasn't always rich. This tower wasn't always stuffed and crumbling, as if it was their fault that the property was now worth so much money. I'd been putting off thinking about it for a while. But there were protest posters in the hallways and leaflets in the mailbox. One of the neighbours had started a campaign, but even he was sick with the stress of it. Every day it seemed there were random men in suits taking measurements, meetings behind closed doors, people from the council who now worked for the management and development companies. But what could we do? No one was listening. It felt like a siege. And then finally the narrator kind of gets moved on from the apartment. I didn't understand, it was too confusing. Peeping out through the tower, I navigated to the wet patch on the sofa and lay there listening to the sound of my own heavy breathing. The knocking on the door was so intense that at first I thought it was just more construction, until under the towel it was hot and humid, and there was more shouting, someone yelling through the letterbox, and that's how they found me when they rammed in the door, hiding on the sofa with a wet towel over my head. I screamed when they touched me, and someone used my old name, one that connected me back to the past and made me feel sick when I heard it. That's not my name, I said, but they weren't listening. My name was just a part of the procedure. Jesus, it stinks in here. You need to take that towel off your head. When I peeped out, there was a broken door and 2 men in suits and a policewoman there. Is there anyone else living here? I have a visitor, but she's going soon, I said. There's no one here. She must have gone out the window. I said this so matter-of-factly that they actually went to the window and looked, even though being on the 17th floor, the window didn't open wide enough for someone to get out. And then they gave me that look, the one that is a mix of pity and fear. Where's my social worker? The man with the papers shrugged. She's off sick. We've got you a bed in a hostel, just till we can sort you out with something else. In the end, I took just one rucksack, some clothes and a few books. I was going to live under the bushes in the park. Later, out in the countryside, I would find an abandoned caravan for a few months. I would travel to the seaside, find a hostel in another town. I'd be cold and hungry and dirty, and I would get very sick. Then, in another town, I saw it on the TV in the day centre, all of us crowded around one of the volunteers' iPads to watch the news. At first, I couldn't believe how quickly it went up. There was something about the flames that was almost starving, the way they consumed a building. Those fancy tiles might as well have been firelighters, the way they accelerated the fire. After a while, I couldn't look. Mrs. Obadike and her son, their cat, all of that waste. Everyone in the day centre was pale and shocked. Some of us who had come from there muttered about going straight to London to show solidarity. I pressed my nails into my palms, overwhelmed by rage. It just seemed so inevitable that of course this was going to happen. This disaster had been happening for years. The neglect, the carelessness, the slow, cruel hardening, and it confirmed what I already knew, that for those of us who have to swim in this water, everything is fucked and everything is on fire.
Julie, thanks very much. I think it's a fantastic story and very well read too. And like all of the other stories that are contained in the book, which is a mammoth work, I have to say, and an amazing feat to have pulled together. I think the interplay between the writers and then the other writers who write factually and put it into context is fascinating and a really kind of unique and interesting way of doing it. So thanks very much, Julia.
You're welcome.
Our next writer and reader is Lucas Jewess. Lucas was born in Birkenhead, just over the water from Liverpool. He was a former literature advisor to the British Council, working with jailed and censored writers. He's published non-fiction about Myanmar and co-edited Hidden Words, Hidden Worlds, the first anthology of short stories from Myanmar, which was published in the UK. He's currently working on his first novel, Cheroots. Lucas's story in this collection is called No Passaran, and it's set during the seminal Liverpool docker strike of 1995 to 1998. So please give a welcome to Lucas, who's going to read from the story for a few minutes.
Hello. Hi, I'm Lucas. As Mike just introduced, I'm from Birkenhead, but I actually live in Myanmar, which is where I'm streaming live from, which shows the reach of the WoW Festival, even in lockdown. Also, as Mike said, I will be reading from my the story about the Dockers disputes, which gives me a certain level of responsibility, considering that the WoW Festival does has its genesis in the Dockers dispute. I hope I've done the Dockers justice, and I think maybe that's what all the contributors to this anthology probably feel, that they've done the best that they can to represent exactly what happened in all these protests that have been dated back over 2,000 years. So I'm going to be reading a short section. It's starting roughly at the beginning. It's set somewhere in the North American continent in 1995. I fucking hate heights, Peter Pan muttered. We know, Lid, Jamjar answered. Everyone knows. He ain't no Peter Pan. That's what everyone said first day you came on the books. Who ever heard of a docker afraid of heights? Then what am I doing up here? Peter Pan peered through the thickened windows of the box at the top of the port control tower. Still booms leered over the wharf below, though neither men could see the cradle lines and hooks as a curtain of sleet crossed over them. Somewhere below, standing to, floating on shore, untied, unable to berth, and held in place by a single tug, was the Poseidon. The curtain drew back for a brief moment. That's why, Lid, Jamjar said. Those pickets at home aren't working. We all know that. I've been in many fights, but none have gone as long as this. Nearly 3 months already. Alan was right. If we can't hurt them at the port, then we hurt them abroad. Peter Pan raised the collar of his coat around the nape of his neck and sunk lower into the plastic seat. Flecks of ice lacerated the box. I know that. I was at the shop stewards meeting. What I meant is, why aren't I down there? John Michael must need some help. He knows what he's doing. Like he said last night, pick up the gear, line up for the muster, go through the gates, don't say a word, get up the control tower. He'll do the rest. Police will come soon, no doubt. Some reporter from the local rag is down there too, John Michael promised. So we just sit here and wait till then? Peter Pan rubbed his gloved hands together. I'm just saying, it's Baltic up here. You're not on your jollies, Lid. Never mind what some of them back home are saying. Every minute, every hour we stay up here is costing them money. Lads below ain't gonna go anywhere. That scab shit won't be worked on as long as we're up here. And Jamjar leant forward and heaved. He coughed, gasped, then spat on the metal floor. You good? Peter Pan asked, shifting in his seat to give Jamjar more space in the box. Though Peter Pan was taller, he was also thin, and his narrow shoulders and slight legs can turn and twist in a box more easily than the shorter and heavier man next to him. Like you said, it's a cold, Lid, nothing more. Jamjar sat back in the plastic chair and wiped his mouth clean of the spittle that had caught on his chin. The two men sat in silence. You got that letter? Jamjar asked Peter Pan. Not opened yet. She told me not to until it was time. Time's now, Lid. Peter Pan reached into the pockets of his trousers. The single piece of paper had curled and creased in the days since he had left Liverpool. He had kept his promise and not looked at it. Read it to me, Jamjar said. It'll be good to hear her. Peter Pan took the paper from his pocket. It was still dark, so he held the letter close. He thought, just for a moment, that she was there with him, somehow, in the way the paper was folded, as small as possible, 5 times or more, so that it couldn't unfurl accidentally, just as her notes to him at school had been. He peeled apart the layers one by one, and Lynn came again, quicker this time, until a wind, having skulked till now, suddenly tore her away. Read it, Lid. I know you haven't gone yet, but we already miss you. Christmas won't be the same. Sharm will ask for you. I don't know what to tell her. She is young. Some are saying we shouldn't say anything, but she learned to read between the lines before she learned to read. She knows something is different. This is why you are there. Don't forget that, for her and us. I don't know what to do. You have gone and I'm here. I can't just sit here. Look after him. He's not as strong as he thinks. This is not like before when he was younger. Look after him and yourself. Peter Pan folded the paper and slipped it back into his pocket. Jamjar had closed his eyes. Somewhere below, blue lights flashed and men started shouting.
Lucas, thanks very much. I think you do more than justice to the dispute. As we discussed, I was personally involved in different ways, excuse me, supporting the disputes. And I think you do something quite remarkable in a very short space of time in the story. You cover the role of the international reach of the Dockers and the activities they took around the world. The role of the women of the waterfront, which was key to the disputes as well. The impact on the families, which, as in your story, can be quite devastating. And also the legacy and what came out of the dispute, particularly around the Casa, which the Dockers bought after the dispute and operated as a bar, obviously, in a community centre. So thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed the reading from that. It's a fantastic story. And I would say to everybody, you know, we're only getting a glimpse of these stories in this event. And I would urge you to buy the book, you know, from Comma Press or from an independent bookshop, preferably as well. And you'll find a huge amount in there. I think it should be on the curriculum. I think it covers so much history that we're not aware of, that we're not taught in school. And you have to find out on your own, which is no bad thing, but a starter in life wouldn't be a bad idea either. Next up is Colleen Smith. Colleen is the author of 3 novels, including Moss Side Massive, which was dramatised by Liverpool's Unity Theatre. She was one of the first Black female crime writers to deal with the subject of drug gangs in inner city Britain. She's the author of several short stories and is currently working on her 4th novel. Julia's The Whistling Bird, in this collection, is set during the horrific events that led to the Notting Hill race riots in 1958. So please welcome Julia to WoWFEST Lockdown. Sorry, Colleen, I'm getting mixed up. Please welcome Colleen Smith to Lockdown. Apologies, Colleen.
Hello, everybody. Hope everyone's okay.
Hi, Colleen.
Right, the section that I'm going to read is the crux of the story. So after 2 days of attacks by white youths, the local West Indian Notting Hill community, they gather for a meeting at a resident's house. He's called Alfonso. Alfonso has 3 daughters and he's very concerned for them. And it soon becomes clear that the 2 days of unprovoked attacks are the last straw. The house was so full. People spilled out of the downstairs rooms into the hall and the stairway leading to the first floor where the girls' bedrooms were. The air was stale with cigarette smoke. Even the open windows, allowing a fresh breeze from the road outside, couldn't disperse the smell. Alfonso had opened up the front room, the best room, and as many people as could squeezed themselves onto the sofa and chairs. The rest stood. By immigrant standards, Alfonso Weatherburn was quite well off. Back home, he'd been a lawyer working in Savannah L'Amour, so wealth was not unknown to him. His family were descendants of plantation owners, and their white European ancestry was evident in Pansy's fair complexion and green eyes. The layered kink to her hair gave away the African bloodline, and she often pressed it straight with a hot comb. Alfonso had come to the mother country because he believed it was his right. He was its here, and no one could or would tell him otherwise. His arrival in 48, however, taught him he was just another black man, and there was no work for him in England as a lawyer. Reluctantly, he learned to drive London's trains, begrudging white lawyers and other professionals boarding his train to their offices in the city in the morning. That was a long time ago. Now he accepted his destiny. He couldn't go back home to Jamaica. Notting Hill was his community now, where he was known as the loansman because he lent money at a reasonable interest rate to fellow countrymen shunned by banks. The extra income allowed him to purchase, decorate, and furnish the 3-story house where around 30 people, men, women, and some children, now assembled. He was glad the girls were out, Pansy at the library, and the others with friends 2 streets over. Celeste Brown, a teacher from Spanish Town, and her husband Patterson had called the meeting after 2 nights of rampaging by the Teddy Boys, following the attack on Raymond and his Swedish wife Madge outside Latimer Road Station. Tea and coffee were available for those who wanted refreshments, and some of the women brought pots of cooked rice and peas with chicken or curried mutton. They mashed up the restaurant last night. The teddy boy them, Celeste began with a tremor in her voice. When the police came from Harrow Road after we called them, I never hear such dirty language in all of my life. And you know what they did? They raided the shop for offensive weapons, take the machete we used to chop meat and shut down the shop. Now we are scared the teddy boy them gonna come back and burn the shop down, just like that house on Latimer Road. It's all we have. Me and Patterson put all we savings in it. Boy, if me did know me was coming here to this, I would have never stepped foot in this godforsaken place. Don't speak like that, Celeste, a young Trinidadian woman called Sarita said. God see the afflicted, and he will deliver us. Cousin, did you tell the Caribbean Welfare Service? Somebody in the room asked. There was a buzz in the room, a hum of discontented voices in unison. Celeste kissed her teeth harshly. It's what they can do. We've been telling the police long time, and they are not listening, and they don't care. Instead of picking up these filth, the teddy boy, they standing back and watching. It's like they don't care. Look what happened to Gilly. I think we should fight back, Patterson, her husband said, tilting his trilby over his dark face, glistening with perspiration. This is a war now. Trusted by so many in the community, Alfonso felt people were waiting for him to speak. No need for that, he said, raising his hand. I've been advising people to get out early, do what they need to do, shopping, work, whatever, and come into their homes and lock up the doors early till it passes over. Suddenly, Alfonso thought about Pansy. Why should we hide like cowards? Hissing teeth and growl-like noises rose from the guests. Not a day goes by when the police don't pick up any Black people just for walking in the street. Nobody cares. Nobody's doing nothing. Celeste brought her fist down on the arm of the chair with each word. I hear some of them white people make a plan for us. Next, then Brixton. I hear there's going to be big trouble like Nottingham. Look at this leaflet they pushed through my door. Celeste handed the leaflet to Alfonso. He knew what it was without looking at it. A leaflet from those fascists, Oswald Mosley's union movement, spelt in its usual garbage. He screwed the paper up and threw it on the low table in front of him. Nobody should panic, he continued, keeping his voice as calm as he could. The storm will ride over. Everything will be... Alfonso heard a smash. From the corner of his eye, he saw the object hurtle into the room, heard the whip of it through the air, and felt its breeze as it flew past his ear, landing on the table, sending the cups and plates flying before crashing to the lino. The screams and shouts that followed almost deafened him. Bodies surged and crushed. Before he could catch his breath, he was clambering to see what had caused the commotion. A large stone lay on the floor in the corner. Broken glass lay sprinkled over most of the guests. Still think we should fight back? Patterson asked, mouth twisted in a scowl, fists clenched into balls of anger. I think it's about time we give these people a damn good rassing.
Colleen, thanks very much. Fantastic reading of what is a superb chapter. I thought it was incredibly emotional chapter, yours, and the different levels that dealt with too, and a reminder of events that took place, just 10 years after Windrush. And, sadly to many, I think, are lost. A lot of people might know about the Notting Hill Carnival, but they may not know about the events that, kind of have sparked the idea for it as well. And a particularly difficult time in the UK. So thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to welcome all of the writers back in to the Zoom room, and we're going to take some questions from the audience, and we're going to have a little bit of obviously a chat amongst ourselves as well. So we've got everybody back in now. Well, thanks very much. I wanted to ask first of all that. I don't know whether you've done this before, where you've been asked to take real events, whether you've been involved or otherwise, and translate them into fiction. And I wanted to know from each of you, what was your kind of inspiration? What was your kind of approach to this? Was it, in terms of research, what was it? Was it a character or a theme or a particular event that kind of allowed you to unlock the way that you were thinking about this and to kind of move it into fiction? So maybe if we just go around. So Julia, you started reading, so.
Sure. I think I was thinking about ideas of home to start with, because I was working, doing some volunteering with a homeless charity. So that's where the character came from. Before I was asked to write this story, I was really thinking about how people fall into, homelessness and what was causing, particularly in the organisation that I was volunteering with. And a lot of it was mental health, people just falling through the cracks. There being inconsistency in social services, not enough people to take care. And then it's very, very easy and very quick for somebody to end up in a sort of homeless situation. And then so Grenfell happened, and it was also something that was happening in another building to a friend of mine. Like I said in my introduction, it was ongoing for about, I would say, 4 or 5 years. Every time I phoned her up, we'd have another update about what's going on with your building, and the roof needed fixing, and the Kensington and Chelsea tenant management organisation was responsible for fixing the building, and it just never happened. I think she ended up with about 5 different sets of builders, never fixing the problem, making it worse, never being able to get hold of anybody on the phone, a really genuine sense of people on the make, or something weird happening behind closed doors. It all got, and then obviously one of her best friends became the chief campaigner in the Grenfell Action Group, and was really, really shouting about it and getting, actually his mental health really suffered, I think, because of that. So I had a sense of this problem happening in West London in the background, and then suddenly the whole thing went up in smoke, and it just seemed so inevitable. It seemed like it was just waiting to happen. All of the things that needed to be in place over the years that preceded it had been slowly falling into place, and it was just a bomb waiting to go off, and none of us were surprised. It was like, well, we were horrified but not surprised. And I think I tried to distill some of those feelings into the story. So it marks a particular period as well in my life, in my thinking. I can trace the story probably kind of came together over a period of about 5 years, really, and then it sort of fell together for this anthology.
Okay, thanks very much. Did you feel a greater responsibility?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, particularly because this is such a totemic issue, literally. I mean, there it is, still standing, not well covered in netting. It's a deep moment of shame for the government. I mean, I don't know how it still hasn't led to any criminal convictions. The people who supplied the cladding immediately took the stuff off the website while the building was still on fire. They knew what they'd done. It wasn't supposed to be put on the buildings up to, I think it was a level up to about 4 stories. You're not supposed to use it above that because they knew it was flammable.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I felt very, very angry about it still. And it traumatized all of my friends who live in West London. I mean, and some of my students who are still dealing with the aftermath of it.
Sure. Lucas, how did you go about unlocking your story? How much were you aware of the events of the Dockers dispute, and what was it that kind of allowed you to feel your way into it?
Well, I mean, I have dim memories of the dispute, but only very dim memories. I was like 15, 16 on the other side of the Mersey, right, on the Wirral. So when I was given the opportunity to choose from a list of protests, I think some of the writers have said that they went for a protest that they hadn't had any knowledge about. But when I saw the one for the Dockers dispute, I've never actually written anything that's based in the UK. I've been overseas now for 20 years, and everything I write is either set in Asia or Africa. So for me to be able to write something that is UK related, and even related to literally the stretch of the river where I live, that was important to me. So I immediately zeroed in on that, and then doing a bit of background research, reading and that on the internet, whatever you can find. And I never knew about the internationalism of the events, of the dispute. And being the fact that I've lived overseas for so long, everything I do tends to be drawn to multiple cultures, multiple countries. And I just exploring it, and then speaking to Mike Carden, the man who gave the the forward, and realizing exactly how big it was. You know, it wasn't, you know, it was massively global. You know, you had like a week of solidarity, which involves something like 40,000, 50,000 dockers in 105 ports in nearly 30 countries, all laying down their tools in support of what was happening in Liverpool. And I think that's just been massively ignored by any of the UK media, as far as I can tell, apart from maybe Pilging, perhaps. So naturally, I was definitely drawn to that, but it was really difficult to try and make what was essentially a global protest in a way, but also make it local. I found that very difficult, I must admit.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to sum up something that went on for 2.5 years or more. But yeah, I mean, the first people ever internationally to go and lock out the American docks in New York, which quite some feat, quite a brave thing, well, incredibly brave thing to do, and you kind of capture that yourself in the opening part of the story. Colleen, from your point of view, how did you kind of approach this? What was your kind of process in taking the events and then moving into the story?
Well, for me, the Windrow Scandal was going on for a while, where, you know, people had lived over here for a while. They'd come from the Caribbean, contributed a lot to, you know, to the United Kingdom, and then found themselves without papers to prove that they'd been here for a while, and they were sent back. So when I was asked to write a story, originally it was the Peterloo story, and that kind of went on the back burner and somebody else wrote it. And then Ra said to me, he's the editor, he said, basically, here's a long list of stories. What would you like to write? And straight away, I saw a story about the Nottingham Riley. It just jumped at me. And for me, that was the passion. So I went away and I did some research. Most of what I saw, even though I was working with a mentor, so I was working with Dr. Kenny Monrose, I decided to go away and do some of my own research first. So I went on YouTube, had a look. Most of what I was seeing on YouTube was quite depressing about that era, about 1958, about, you know, coming to this country, not being able to find work. And I also read a book called The Lonely Londoners, which was completely different from what I was seeing on YouTube. It was basically a lot of people living together in harmony, so I wanted to put a sort of like balance of that in my story. So I wanted to show that it wasn't all doom and gloom, that there were communities living alongside each other. And then I just plunged into the story. I knew I wanted to write about a single parent and his daughters, and then I put in the love story. So it was the white boyfriend and the black girlfriend against the background of the riots.
Yeah, the end point, I was interested in that, because the end point of that is a kind of coming together of them again. It felt to me like you were making a statement that after the riots, that there was like a unity, a hope, something that was going to move forward. Yeah,
I suppose for me the symbolism was the bird, the whistling bird, and the fact that she taught him to whistle that, you know, the bird of where she came from in Jamaica, and for that was a symbol of hope for the future, that, you know, people can come together. Doing the research and learning as well about Claudia Jones, I never knew, I'm ashamed to say, never knew who Claudia Jones was. She was the original founder of the Notting Hill Carnival. And finding information about the carnival, the first carnival, was very hard to source on the internet. And when I dug through all the layers and found out that it was this superb event, I just couldn't believe it. A fantastic event, and it wasn't outside as you would imagine the first carnival to be. It was actually indoors with, you know, an array of stars and events and cooking, and fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So that was the predecessor of Notting Hill Carnival today.
Well, you've kind of, in a way, answered the question I was about to ask. So I'm going to ask it to Julia and to Lucas. Were you Well, and by the way, obviously Colleen joining as well, if I'm not excluding you from the question. But was there anything particularly you learned from the work on your stories and the research, or anything that surprised you, you know, when you looked into them?
I think how angry I was. I mean, how personally angry and cross I was. And also, I don't know anybody who's been in London in the last, 10 years, the sort of hyper gentrification of the streets, even the streets around me. I live in Tottenham, which is the sort of other end of sort of more towards northeast London. And just the sense that even a car park was going to be area for gentrification, and the fact that it was just all hell for leather, build as fast as I can, don't worry about standards, don't worry about whether the building will fall down in 10 minutes, everybody's going to make a load of money. And there was just this sort of sense of rapacious capitalism. I think the story was, for me, was my act of protest. It was the only thing I could do. It was a sort of howl in the dark. And also because at the time as well, I was suffering with neighbours who were developing their flat upstairs and had used a bunch of cowboy Romanian builders who hadn't got any safety certificate. I mean, they basically fucked it up really badly, and it took a whole load of time to unscrew it up, and it cost me a lot of mental energy and time and pain. So I was sort of going through this weird personal issue with building development, non-stop building noises. So I don't know. And then Grenfell happened, and London suddenly seemed to be incredibly hostile in terms of home. Where do I live? How can we find people being squished into smaller and smaller kinds of accommodation, poor people, the bedroom tax, people being pushed out into the margins. And I wonder what lockdown is going to do, whether this economic crisis that's about to sort of come and hit us on the head, whether this will do something good to our economy in terms of lowering the price of housing and make it possible again. People might well end up living in office blocks because we're all going to be working from home. I don't know, but to a certain extent, we need a pause, because I was just like, where's this going to end? And Grenfell felt to me very much like a totem for that whole feeling. It sort of stood for the whole, and a dreadful, dreadful thing, all those people. But it's at the same time, it's just seemed to stand for the corruption under the surface. There's so much corruption, just the lack of legislation, suddenly the council signing off on a building that suddenly a huge tower block turns up in Tottenham, and you're like, where did that come from? When did we agree that was going to happen? And every single corner of London, there was a little protest. Please don't develop this, don't knock this down, don't turn this into another block of houses or a gastropub.
Okay, Lucas, anything you surprised by or that you learned?
Well, I think partially answered in my previous answer about the size of it, yeah. But I think another thing was also the ripple effect. There's maybe a sort of malaise among the dockers that when they eventually capitulated to the Merseyside Dock and Harbour Company, that they sort of lost the battle. After 2.5 years, they didn't get the jobs back, so they lost, right? But Mike Carden was one of the shop stewards coordinators, and he has a son, Dan Carden, who is the MP for Walton, and he was also for 2 years in 2018 to 2020 the shadow secretary for the international development, so the UK's overseas aid agency, right? And he did a very interesting interview with the Prospect magazine, I think, where he said that his experience as a child living through that, and he did live through that. He went on the protest marches, he did the signs, he was politicized by what he lived through, and that he understood that the only reason why his father, Mike Carden's, and all the other dockers managed to survive for so long was international solidarity, and he wanted to take that kind of international solidarity, that knowledge of that, and bring it into UK government, into the UK government policy regarding our interaction overseas. And it's, to me, that kind of ripple effect where you just don't know what's going to happen. A generation later, the UK can benefit from what the dockers did. It wasn't just a one-off thing. It's in the past. Let's forget about it and move on, which it seems to be like a lot of people are telling the dockers to do. Move on. Just forget about it. But the generation that grew up with that can also make a massive impact on UK and UK relations internationally. Thanks.
I've got some questions coming in from the audience, which I wouldn't mind jumping over to, if that's okay with all of you. First one is a general one. Do you think the fiction can sometimes tell the story of hardship better than facts? Colleen?
I think with fiction, we have the license really to play with creativity, but also project the passion more than when something's factual. It's just sort of like one layer, isn't it? So, but with fiction, you can go below certain levels, and it's more passionate. So I think so, most definitely.
Yeah. What do you think, Lucas?
Ironically, the non-fiction book I wrote was about the struggle of the writers in Myanmar in the ethnic borderlands and communities who have been suffering from 50 years of government censorship of their own language. So that was a non-fiction book, and it was actually quite difficult to really explain exactly what they had to go through. And I think if I had the choice to write a novel about that, I would find that a much more explorative sort of a medium in order to do that. With the non-fiction, a lot of it was just lists, fact, figures, times, dates, this happened and then that happened, but I didn't really get to explore it in proper detail. So I would definitely agree with Colleen that I think fiction gives a certain broader scope to really delve into it.
Do stories dig into us deeper, Julia, rather than just pure fact?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I've been writing a lot of essays, and personal essays, which is basically just me in the world noticing things, or at least trying to use my life as evidence for argument to show what I see. So I guess I found that non-fiction's been more helpful to me in that way. Sometimes with fiction, I find it difficult not to preach. You know, there seems to be such an essential message that you want to get across, and you have to remember to take the story, to bring the story with you. I think one of the things that's amazing about this anthology was how much I actually learned from reading all of the other contributions and the other sort of the stories, and the interesting split between the fiction and then the accompanying essay, which sort of explains the context to the piece. I think it's an incredibly useful, and Rob Page has done another one as well. There's 2 volumes in this series, and they seem like an incredibly useful history of protest movements and an exploration. And it doesn't matter really, the 2 things feel to me like 2 sides of the same coin. They're both giving me something. I'm not sure that I could say that either was better.
Well, you know, just Colin, you worked with Dr. Kenny Monrose, Lucas, you worked with Mike Carden, and Julia, you worked with Daniel Rennie. Can you tell, and just to give background to people, every piece in this collection is a short story, and obviously our 3 writers here have contributed, and it's followed by somebody else. They may be an academic, they may be an activist, or they may have some other relation to it, who've written a kind of factual account. Can you tell us about your relationship between yourself and the person who writes the piece immediately following your fiction? So Lucas, in your case, it was Mike Carden, who's one of the Dockers, was one of the Dockers leaders during the dispute. Did you know Mike before, or did you contact him, and how did that relationship develop between the 2 of you?
I didn't know him before. No, Rob Page introduced us. My relationship with Mike Carden was actually quite fleeting, because once he heard the angle that I was wanting to go down for the story, he put me in touch with 2 other Dockers, Terry, when I get these names right, I do apologize. Terry Teague and Tony Nelson, Terry and Tony. And they were the international coordinators for the dispute. So obviously they had a lot more pertinent information to what I was looking at. I also spoke to a Doreen McNally, who is part of the Women on the Waterfront movement, because that is involved in the story as well. Plus also half of my story is set in the CASA. And so I need to speak to the staff who run the CASA as well to understand exactly how that kind of organization works. And if anybody doesn't know, the CASA is in an amazing place in Liverpool, on Hope Street. It's a bar, it's a pub. You know, you can go there, you can have a drink, you can have your wedding there. I think they had the first gay wedding in Liverpool or the UK, I'm not sure. But it's also a monument to the memory of not just the Dockers dispute, but also any labour movements that have happened in the UK over the last century. It's a fantastic place. They do social welfare advice for free for people. It's a great community organisation. So I spoke to a lot of people, to be honest, not just one person.
Thanks. Colleen, it was Dr. Kenny Munrose who wrote the afterword to your piece, and he's I think he's an academic, and I read that he was the author of Black Men in Britain, an ethnographic portrait of the post-Windrush generation. So what was the relationship between the development of your piece and Dr. Kenny's, or you know, how did you kind of in any way collaborate together?
Well, we didn't collaborate together. What I did with Dr. Kenny was I would approach him if I wasn't sure about certain facts. Like I said, most of the information I could get off the internet, and also my dad came over 1958, so I remember a lot of things that he told me about what it was like to come over here, and he spoke as well about the Notting Hill race riots. I think for me, speaking to Dr. Kenny was also learning about how the whole situation, back then it wasn't even called a race riot. They sort of like, you just dimmed it down and just called it a riot. But yeah, so I just basically just called him when I needed to call him. I just carried on with the story because I'm the sort of person like that. I kind of I write the story and then I research as I go along. So whenever I need to call him, and he was just a phone call away or just an email away, you know, he's very supportive like that. So yeah, just talking to him and YouTube and remembering things from my youth. Or
Thanks. Julia, you worked with David Rennick, who he's produced some stuff around Grenfell already, including The Failed by the State, which was I think was a production. And then there was an essay organising on Mute, which was published in after Grenfell. Did you know David beforehand? Or
no, I didn't. And we didn't have much of a discussion, unfortunately, partly because he was brought in rather at the last minute because there was somebody else we were trying to get to do it who we couldn't make the timing work. And actually, for me, the most important part of the research was the Grenfell Action Group blog, which is still online. And actually, as a document, it's the most amazing thing because it started in 2012. So that gives you a sense of how long that whole protest was going on before Grenfell actually sort of happened to prove their point. And it was deliberately set up as an action group to sort of counter what was the development that was going on. And so that really helped to formulate my thinking around what had actually happened, along with the really very disappointing piece in the LRB by Andrew O'Hagan, which I had an enormous problem with for various reasons. I thought that it was a huge missed opportunity, 60,000 words of the whole edition taken over by his reportage, which I felt was incredibly partisan and partial and cap doffing to the posh people of Kensington and Chelsea. And he used his background of growing up in a council house in order to give him the right, I suppose, to write that piece. But I felt that it very much landed quite heavily on the side of the council, you know, and it wasn't their fault. It's the financialization that's to blame. They were just trying to save money. And I just, sorry, I can't buy that. I just think it's one of those things where everybody has in that food chain has some responsibility for what happened, I think. And because the Grenfell Action Group's been complaining about it since 2012, they can't say they didn't know.
Thanks very much. There's a couple of questions. One that's come in was we had an event on the media the day before yesterday, and the failures of the mainstream media. And somebody has said, I imagine you all use media reports for your research, for your amazing stories of resistance. Are there any reporters or media voices that you trust to tell the real story of events like these? And feel free to kind of expand out a little bit from that if you want to. Colleen, maybe go to yourself first.
Media stories. Sorry, say that question.
Well, it was asking, are there any reporters or media voices that you trust, if you like, to tell the real story of events, you know, like these? And you know, so I suppose you referred to Windrush. Windrush is obviously now very contemporary in the sense of obviously, you know, what's been happening over the last couple of years in relation to the Windrush generation.
Oh well, the Voice newspaper, that you know, then I suppose I would say they would, but I can't really think of anybody else. I mean, when we think about media stories, if you look at what was reported back in 1958, I think it was just PATH News. It wasn't really the BBC.
Okay, what about yourself, Lucas, in relation to the media?
Do you mean for the story or in general?
Well, I suppose in a way, it depends on obviously what you looked at in the past, but you can expand that out general, because in some ways, although the book itself covers stories from various kind of times of the past, during the lockdown, now and obviously recent events, there's lots of debate about the role of the media and their kind of reporting of events and movements of resistance or rebellion or popular movements or stuff like that, and how they report it. So I suppose we could generalize it out as well.
Well, I'm Asia specific, so in terms of like UK and Western media, I don't read a lot of, to be honest. So, but in terms for Asia, like Burma Watchers and what's happening in the Philippines with Duterte, what's happening in Indonesia, I have individuals who I trust, not necessarily the papers that they necessarily write for, but individuals. There's probably one for each country in the ASEAN region, give or take, who I can, to a certain extent, trust that they're reporting that the way that they can, with the information that they have, because information here can be quite hard to get from government sources and for other political reasons. But yeah, I mean, it does. I don't know, for example, in Myanmar, Frontier magazine is a very, I think, good source of information as far as they can get.
Okay. In relation to Grenfell, Julia?
Oh, I think there's so much problems with the way the media reported it. I mean, I just mentioned the piece in the LRB, which I thought was a terrible kind of missed opportunity to really dig underneath the surface of what really went wrong. And I was very disappointed by that. I think in a more broad sense, I'm quite worried about how the mainstream media is so connected to big money and is owned by offshore, apart from maybe one or two newspapers, they're all owned by big billionaires who live offshore and who have vested interests in suppressing certain kinds of news. And that seems to me to be quite obvious, the way that they've tried to turn the Extinction Rebellion into something that's now offensive and is going to be banned. I mean, these things creep around the edges, and this has always happened. I mean, I'm very aware what happened to the Sun in Liverpool because of that, and the way in which the Daily Mail also just pumped out, lie after lie after lie after lie, particularly around Grenfell, I think. So I have a very mixed feeling about our media. I think it's incredibly corrupt. I mean, the fact that even Wikipedia won't use the Sun or the Daily Mail as newspapers of record, I think tells you what you need to know. And other European countries look at our media and they can't quite understand how come it's so biased and so driven by a particular kind of right-wing agenda. And then you look who owns the newspapers. So my feeling about the Grenfell piece particularly was that I was going to trust the people on the ground. So the Grenfell Action Group, these were the people who live in the building. And also my friend who had the management company, she knew what was going on. These were people that were dealing with this situation day in, day out.
It's yeah, well, you mentioned the Sun in Liverpool. I'm no strangers, the take on the media. I kind of personally feel when if you line up the front pages of the main press, if you like, it feels like a 40-50 year war that is taking place on the front pages. How would you reflect, Colleen, in relation to Windrush and developments now, that have happened? How would you reflect, and obviously your piece is on Notting Hill, in relation to Race Today in the UK? Because news just came. I mean, the government, which was quite astonishing, we're going to put a surcharge upon the NHS staff who are not from the UK, and a day later they reversed that decision. But I found it quite astonishing. I mean, I found it astonishing anyway, but the very fact that they were doing it in the midst of this pandemic. How do you think that reflects, and how do you feel that reflects in relation to race today? And do you think issues of Windrush most recently are having an effect upon that too, in terms of pushing things forward?
Well, you know, nothing surprises me anymore. No, nothing surprises me anymore. I watch the news and I hear things, and I don't think we've moved. You know, we've not really moved forward. You know, in terms of, and it's really, really sad in terms of, you know, the whole Windrush thing just shouldn't have happened, and it carried on for years, and people were being deported for silly reasons. And how did this happen? You know, and who allowed it to go on, basically? And it's just so sad. When I wrote The Whistling Bird, a year after the riots, this young lad called Kelso Cochran was murdered by 3 white youths, and basically to this day, they've not found the killers, and that runs parallel with the Stephen Lawrence story. So, when you think about it, how much have we progressed? And like I said before, nothing surprises me. It doesn't surprise me. It just, I just try not to focus on the news too much.
There was it's an interesting point, isn't it, how far we progressed. There was a question that was directed to you, Julia, on Grenfell, but I kind of think it made, we could all get involved in this discussion. Where it said, Julia, having been there myself in the immediate aftermath and seen the response to the community, I think it became apparent very quickly as now that we can only really depend upon each other. We can forget government support, it seems. Why do you think this event was not able to amass the wider population of those neglected for so long to stand up and unite and take much more direct action, or at least become actively intolerant? And I would throw that out. I'm going to go to Julia first, but throw that out and say, are we too tolerant? Should we be, more actively intolerant, to use that phrase? Julia?
I think we've got to look at why. And there's a quote from Chomsky that I came across when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, where he says, a market society automatically carries with it an undermining of solidarity. I love that quote. A market society automatically carries with it an undermining of solidarity. So we have a society in which we're atomized. We all have to market ourselves. We're in it on our own. That's what's so obvious about the response to this particular crisis that we're going through at the moment, is that we're being discouraged from showing a kind of national solidarity. The government's message is deliberately trying to throw the blame back at us, in the same way that I think in Grenfell, the newspapers started to blame the residents, or to suggest that it was a tower full of illegal immigrants, or everybody there was on benefits and was dodging their benefits, or was cheating the government or something. And very quickly, that sort of narrative of money grabbing. And I think we are in a situation where left and right needs to, well, at least the left needs to reorientate itself. It really needs to start to talk about what it is that it wants instead of this market society. I really do. And I feel like we haven't found the language for that yet. And one of the words that keeps coming up a lot for me at the moment in response to the situation of coronavirus is care. The care can't be monetized. We can't put a value on it. Suddenly we realize we need people to care for us, to look after us. We need people in those hospitals. We need people to look after people in care homes. And there's another big scandal coming down the road pretty soon about the fact that care homes are being sold off to big American healthcare companies. And you've got people who are, on minimum wage gig economy workers looking after people who've got complex needs in their old age. How did this happen? Why did this happen? It's the same issue again with Grenfell. Financialization down to the granular level, where everything is instead of it being a collective responsibility, is the responsibility of the individual company. And then we just get lost in lists and litigation, and everything gets so complicated that it's really hard to operate as a group. So I guess that's my reading of it. It's just a question of how we articulate that, or how we articulate a response to it. Because I feel instinctively that it's immoral and it's wrong, but I don't know quite how we can formulate a sense of collectivity under those conditions.
Okay. Lucas, Colleen, what's your thoughts? I'm sorry, who wants to go first? Lucas.
Right. One of the things that came out of the Dockers thing was a sense of betrayal by their union, betrayal by the government, betrayal by the media. And I think when everybody's betraying you, who can you trust, and what's the point? But going from my own experience, I don't think protest is futile. For example, if you look at certain protests in countries in ASEAN, it takes a long time. It takes up to 5 decades of protest before you can enforce some kind of change. I can fully understand how that can be demoralizing. But even with the people that I've met here, it's multi-generational. Every decade they go back onto the streets. They do what they need to do to make their voice heard. I guess that's easy for me to say, but I don't think protest is futile. It just takes a long time.
I think with me, with the Notting Hill story, what I liked about it was the triumph in the end, is that nobody was going to put up with it anymore. And everybody just got together and they decided to fight back. And that's what's going to happen in the long run. People will just get together and fight back.
I thought it was interesting about the book and kind of reading it in its totality, because when I opened it, I wasn't really expecting to go back to AD 60 and the uprising of Boudicca. I think what was interesting is you kind of begin to see this continuum, this spectrum over a long time. And you think, if these people in the Rebecca risings in Wales, for example, if these people hadn't have taken the action that they did, would we have the position that we now have? Because I know there's lots of problems in the UK and in the world, but things are obviously immeasurably better. But they weren't given, and at every stage of the way they've tried to curtail. And one of the things about Britain, it has this, or portrays this image of being of the great democracy, and actually we've had a fairly brutal history on so many levels, obviously within the UK and internationally as well. But do you feel like yourselves when you kind of look at it and you think, like you said there, Lucas, people kind of coming out and just pushing and pushing, because people can get disheartened sometimes when, like the end of the Docks dispute, or when you're still battling on Windrush many years later, or Grenfell with the impasse at the moment. Julia?
Yeah, well, I think there's something interesting. There's two things that came out of that. Firstly, what Lucas said about time and how much time it takes for things to change. And that, you come out there maybe as a young person being all zealous and hoping you can make something change overnight. And then you realize it's a lifetime's work to keep being noisy and to keep protesting, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting, which is actually to do with you and how the festival came about as a kind of consequence. I mean, you're mentioned in the essay about the Dockers strike as the Writing on the Wall festival emerging from that protest movement. And in a way, sometimes the things that emerge from a protest movement might not be the result that you wanted, but something comes from a right angle, from that meeting of minds or from that group of people that will show itself in future years. So I think that's an interesting consequence of resistance and protest. We're dealing with kind of forces that aren't controllable, but there will always be some kind of outcome. I don't know what happened. I'd like to know how you ended up doing the festival on the back of, how it came out.
I would like to know that as well.
Yeah.
I'd like to know too. It kind of developed, I think, around some of the creative work that was done. Just a very brief thing on the Dockers dispute, which was an amazing thing to be involved with. You had 500 of the Dockers who'd been, if you like, the traditional Dockers who'd been there a long time, but a younger layer of Dockers had come in. And that was actually where the dispute started, in a place called Torside, where they were employed, which then led to the older Dockers coming out as well. And one of the aspects of the dispute was, sometimes people would look at the Dockers and think, it's kind of like the old dinosaurs in terms of the trade union movement. I have to say it was one of the most radical and creative and forward-thinking disputes I've ever seen, because they, as you referred to, Lucas, they developed an incredible international network, which still exists to this day as well. But they were also very inventive and creative in the way they went about it. They had KLF involved. They had, I think it was Noel or Liam Gallagher did a gig. They began to kind of push out into popular culture. And one of the things they did, which was really inventive, was they created a T-shirt that said, support the sacked 500 Dockers. And the CK of Dockers was done in the Calvin Klein logo. And I mean, that was already popular, but then they got some Liverpool players to wear them under their shirts during an international game. And at the end of the game, or when he scored, Robbie Fowler lifted up his T-shirt and it just went around the world. And so they knew that there was other ways. And I think that this thing about telling stories is very interesting, because I mean, Ken Loach was involved. I ended up being involved in taking part in writing the film Dockers with Jimmy McGovern led a team of people, which was 8 Dockers, four of the women of the waterfront, myself and another guy who was an activist, Evan Welsh, was involved. And the film ended up on Channel 4. Now, that was after the dispute, but I think it reflected the fact of the way that they were trying to tell the dispute. It wasn't just in boardrooms or committee meetings, wasn't just on the picket line. They did all of those things, but they were able to get the story across quite powerfully. And so out of that just became some discussions about the idea of launching a festival that was a little bit different. And a group of us got together, and it started in the year 2000 with a five-day festival, and continues to this day. And the legacy of the dispute is our festival, and is also the Casa, which you referred to, Lucas, which is a bar and advice centre that's run by the Dockers. And we're now working on, Mike Carden has written a book on the dispute that we are working with them to hope, well, we were talking about bringing out September this year on the 25th anniversary of the beginning of the dispute, but that's obviously gone now, and we'll probably be talking about it next year. One more question, which I think was a really nice one. Someone wrote in and said, these stories are vital and beautifully written. Have the writers had any feedback from the communities and people that they engage with in this, or the people that they focus on? So has there been any feedback, do you think? Or have you had the chance to pick up anything from people's reaction to the story that you've written?
Unfortunately, lockdown seems to have locked down some of the events that I would have done, that would have been able to sort of, I was going to do something in Newham and another workshop event that both got cancelled because of the coronavirus situation.
Yeah. Has that been the same for Lucas and Colleen?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, yeah.
I don't think anybody's here has read the book, to be honest. So I don't get back to the UK that much. So.
Okay, when you think about resistance then, and what you've reflected in your work, and looking into the Notting Hill race riots, Grenfell fire, the Dockers dispute. One thing that we kind of explored was, well, is resistance kind of futile? And, what forms does it take? And one thing that kind of leads you to is, are people, I suppose, in a way, maybe optimistic? And what role and do they think, even not just, but even the book that Common Press have published that you've all written for, do you think that plays a role? Do you think it can have a significant role in moving things forward? And how do you feel yourselves reflecting back upon the work that you've done, and maybe looking out into wider society? How do you feel? Do you feel optimistic? Do you feel pessimistic at the moment? Obviously taking into account lockdown, but maybe outside of that as well. Who'd like to start? You raise your eyebrows first, Julia. So first.
I've got something to say about hope, I think, and about resistance being an act of hope. Because I think if we just sit there and think, oh well, it's all screwed and we can't change anything, that's almost as bad as saying, oh well, la la la, it's all going to be all right. That actually these things are verbs, they're not abstract nouns. We have to think about them as things we have to enact. We have to enact hope. We have to hope that, and in order to do that, we have to do things. So I guess writing the Grenfell story made me feel more hopeful in a way, because in my small, tiny, weeny little way, I could shout, I could say something. I had an opportunity, a platform to actually say, no, this is not okay. And I think with that hope comes, and I think you really illustrated it when you talk about what happened on the back of the Dockers strike. I'm an educationalist, I teach, and I think education can come out. And I was really heartened when I saw on the streets the Extinction Rebellion kids with all of their placards. And, you know, these are teenagers suddenly getting incredibly politically engaged in a way that I haven't seen teenagers, young people really engaged in politics in the way that they are at the moment. And that's going to have a legacy. That's going to have a creative and political legacy. We don't know where it's going to go. And I hope that that will lead to some changes, and it will take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And the fact that the government wants to actually close them down means that they're having an effect. So in a way, that's a good thing. So yeah, I think I think we have to pick our battles, because it's costly, and it's expensive to our mental health and to our state of mind if we're constantly in a state of resistance. So I would want to make it into a hopeful verb as well, rather than something that's always going to make us unhappy. I think there's going to be some struggles coming down the road on the back of this coronavirus. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Colleen?
Oh, resistance is a powerful thing. And when you look back at the Notting Hill Carnival, that resistance out of the story, out of that came the Notting Hill Carnival, I should say, which unfortunately has been cancelled. Yeah, there'll be no Notting Carnival. But when you think about it, how many people come from far and wide on the back, really, of the riot in 1958. So out of resistance becomes powerful, and just brings joy and everything. So let's hope it's back next year. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, interesting. Actually, I was just thinking in my answer on the Dockers and the art festival coming out of it, similar thing. Cultural comes out of it, becomes a celebration and a unification as well. Lucas?
Well, I'm living in a country which has 70-year civil wars, so I'm of the belief that resistance is not futile so long as there is hope, which I think somebody mentioned before. So.
Okay. As an organisation, one thing that we do, you may not be aware, we run a lot of projects. We've got one, Right to Work for Unemployed Writers, moving forward as a writing development, Life of Grime, a spoken word project for young people, Superheroes, Words Are Our Power, which is primary school. We do all kinds of projects, and we publish, fiction, and we publish a lot from our projects too. So one thing we, as an organisation, we do is we try to engage people in writing themselves. And so there's a question come up which has said, what advice would you give to writers who want to blend both history and fiction? They've said, how important is the truth? And I would add to that is, how do you find the truth in this type of work as well? So we'll take this as the last question. So, a couple of lines from each of yourselves really will be really, really valuable. I know that the people who watch and take part in this festival love listening to writers and always are keen to try and gain something from them. And I think this is a very interesting one around, taking these historical events, particularly around resistance in this instance. So how do you blend both the history and fiction? How important is the truth? How do you find the truth or how do you reach for the truth maybe in the work that you're doing? So let's go back in reverse then. So we'll take Lucas on this one, please, first.
This was the hardest short story I've ever written, primarily because it's the blend of fact and fiction, and there are a lot of people alive today who may even notice certain characters that I put in there. So for me, it was finding the truth was fairly simple because I knew exactly what I wanted to write about. It was describing that truth through the characters, because the characters are based on real people who live probably less than 2 miles from where you are now, Mike. I struggled with that a lot, and I worried that people would see a part of them in what I've written, and they would be unhappy with it. And I struggled with that a lot. And as I said before, I haven't had feedback, so I'm guessing that's no feedback is good feedback at that point.
Yeah, they're all looking for you.
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm still living here, mate. That's why I haven't gone back home.
All right, thanks very much. Colleen, okay, to go to you next.
Yeah, just like Lucas, I struggled with this one. I saw the deadline looming, and I kept on putting it off for a while because I've never done anything like this before. I've never, when I wrote Moss Side Massive, it was different. I lived in that time and I could, pull on certain things, but to actually go and research something and try and make it as accurate as possible, and at the same time making it literary was very, very difficult. It was the hardest short story I've ever written. So it's not easy. It can be done. you just make a start, and basically, and you just check things as you go along, and it is very, very difficult, but it can be done.
All right, thank you. Julia?
I think there's something that I quote at my students quite a bit from Ezra Pound, who I'm not that keen on, but it's one of the most useful things he said, which is that the fundamental accuracy of statement is the only morality a fiction need have. And I think what I read into that statement is that you really have to make the piece resonate with an emotional truth. So sometimes it's not possible to put in all of the ins and outs of every single detail of the thing that happened, but you need to try and get down to the heart of the emotional truth of that matter. What was the injustice? So I think that's why it's really difficult, because you have to really, really think and sharpen the writing and the thinking. That's why it took a long time. I would agree with Colleen. It was a very difficult commission. This, I you know, like you, I weaved around it, saw the deadline coming, thought, oh my God, no, I've got notes, loads of notes, I've done tons of reading. Oh no. Yeah, it was hard. It doesn't come easy, especially because if you take it really seriously, you want to get it right.
I agree.
All right, well, look, I want to say thank you to yourselves, to Colleen, Lucas, and Julia, for what has been a really, really engaging and interesting discussion. I've learned a lot from the discussion. I want to say a huge thanks to Comma Press for what I think is an absolutely outstanding achievement, pulling this work together. I think it's interesting the way that you've all talked about the difficulty of the commission. I think it must be quite a mountain to climb to coordinate all of this work between the fiction writers, between the fact writers, if you like, in terms of the people who did the context, and also of you know, kind of pulling out, because this covers a huge amount, but there's many more, I imagine, you know, resistance movements or moments that could have been covered in this. I do think that the work that you've done in terms of the stories, not just the facts, because I do think stories are incredibly powerful in terms of being able to bring the news to people. I think one of the earlier stories made the point in the book how important oral history is, and that's what kept alive the memories for a very long time. And I think the work that yourselves have done now, I think, is part of that, and you know, will be carried forward. As you say, it's difficult during the lockdown to try and get feedback. But yeah, hopefully you'll be kind of out on the road with the book in the near future. And I would urge everybody to go to Common Press's website, or go to, you know, your independent press's website, and to order this book, which is, you know, Resist, Stories of Uprising, and take time to read it. It's absolutely fantastic. I want to say thanks to you all for taking part, for contributing to the book, obviously, you know, so that we can enjoy the work. And I would like to wish you all the very best in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to say a real thanks to yourselves, our audience, for taking part and for supporting Writing on the Wall and our WoWFEST Lockdown Festival. I really enjoyed that event, and it's been really interesting reflecting upon the history of the resistance as told by these writers, but also about the where Writing on the Wall came from too, which we're very, very proud of. I want to thank everybody who submitted questions. They can't all be answered, I'm afraid, and you know, we do our best, but sometimes better to come out with more questions than answers. This event will be posted on Facebook and YouTube in the coming days, so you'll be able to watch it again. Please share it with everybody that you know. I want to say thanks to everyone who's made the donation. If you'd like to donate and support Writing on the Wall, fan support and food banks, and the South Liverpool Domestic Abuse Services, please go to our website, writingonthewall.org.uk, or follow the link in the comments section below, and you can make a donation which will support our work. You'll also find a link there to a feedback form. We're really interested in what audiences think of our work. It helps us to shape and develop it, so please fill that in when you get a chance. Special thanks to our funders and sponsors who've been amazing in supporting us to pull off this online festival in what was a very short space of time. So that's the Institute of Creative Enterprise at Edge Hill University, Unison Northwest, the School of Writing at Liverpool John Moores University, Arts Council England, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, Granada Foundation, and the Paul Hamlin Foundation as well. If you'd like to be one of our sponsors, either for the festival in the future, for our Black History Month festival coming up in October, or for any of our activities and our projects, some of which I mentioned before, you'll find our contact details on the website. As I said earlier, we have a full program running until the end of the month. Amazing events. Stuart McConey coming up, I think on Friday. Lynn Gardner, the theatre critic, coming up on Monday. Too many to mention, really. We run until the 31st. When we finish, which I think is quite fitting for this event, we finish with a call to the arts by the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and that's going to take place on the 31st of May. So please check out the website. Come along to all of the events. You know, we really enjoy your support, and we really enjoy sharing what we think is some great art and culture during our festival. Thanks again for taking part. Please stay safe, keep connected. Good night.